The sun has left and forgotten me. It's dark.
Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief storymaker at Elkins Consulting. Today's episode is a long time coming. My friend Cole Mannix is joining me, and we're sitting in our co-working space in the sidecar, thanks to Jason O'Neill and his brilliant thinking about our community needing a community place to meet, to work, and to keep each other accountable. And that is what I count on for the people around me. If you need to know how to keep yourself accountable, think about taking the StrengthsFinder assessment at Gallup, because anytime you know more about how your brain works, you will benefit. So today's episode, we're going to begin by asking Cole to share something about himself that most people don't know. Cole, the reason I ask this question is that we have a tendency to hold people or anchor people in time based on one interaction we have with them, especially because we have easy access to social media and we think we know people based on what we see in this one aspect of our lives. So by sharing something about yourself that people might not know about you, we give our audience an opportunity to learn the more complexity behind who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
oh,
what do you
that's
think?
An interesting question. I guess I would say that maybe most people don't know that I was, at one point in my life, I thought I was going to become a priest. And that path changed. But in Helena, I think people now know me for restaurants, even though I don't know anything about those. But it's a very different path. So,
wow.
Yeah, maybe that's one little fun little fact.
How old were you when you thought you had that calling?
Well, I grew up Catholic, and both my mom and dad's side, they both thought about it fairly different. But mom in particular was one of 11 kids in a very kind of traditionally Catholic family. And I think anytime you're part of the church, you're feeling, as if you're a boy, you're sort of being suggested to you all the time that maybe there's this calling. But also I was a curious person. And by the time I got into college, I was asking a lot of questions about where do these beliefs come from? And mom had been a CCD teacher, and so I was somebody that CCD. I think it stands for
it's a Catholic,
some kind of Christian youth education.
Right.
I can't remember what
it was
stands
Wednesday
for,
afternoons, right? After school or Wednesday evenings.
I'm not sure if you were that consistent about when exactly it happened, but yeah, it was like programmatic kind of after school. There would be a teacher, usually a parent, that taught it, and anyway, I was just a curious person, never had a career in mind. And I had, I went to Montana Tech for a year after high school in metallurgy. Had no idea exactly. I was playing football. It was nearby. And then I transferred to Carroll. I did a degree in biology and another one in philosophy. And during that period, I started to get more interested in kind of history, the liberal arts, faith, God stuff. Why are we here? What's the life worth living? And anyway, I had two wonderful teachers in particular that, a guy named Dan Shea in town, who was an Anaconda guy and taught the classics at Carroll, and a woman who's now passed named Sister Annette Moran. They had both gone to school in Boston at he at BC and she at a school called Weston, Jesuit, and I applied to Weston and wound up in Boston as this kid from a tiny little town of Helmville with a post office and a bar.
You said you were the only graduate from your graduating class.
In 8th grade, I was
and
the only 8th grade.
And in Boston.
So yeah, it's just a funny path, it's hard to...
What did you do in Boston?
I was doing a master's degree in systematic theology, which just means that it was sort of a specialty in understanding where certain doctrines and teachings and ideas about who God is and where traditions in, the church come from. Mm-hmm. And anyway, at that time, definitely was thinking, well, maybe I will be some kind of maybe that I'll be part of the priesthood in some form or fashion, whether that was the academic or the more of the pastoral side. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
What changed?
Well, I don't know if it's really changed so much as I think of what you serve really matters. Mm-hmm. And I still want to serve God as I understand God, which is to say that it's quite a mystery, but I do think certain things are what is good, what is beautiful, what is true, even if we can't ever completely grasp that. Mm-hmm. They sort of demand your assent. Okay. And I think we, in different ways, we all seek to, what can I give my life to? Like, what is
your purpose?
What is worth the limited time? And we all have a limited time. And life, no matter how rich it is, will involve plenty of suffering. And if you decide what's worth suffering for and what's worth giving yourself over to, and sometimes that's, it's multiple things. It's marriage, it's children, it's friends, it's causes. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I just think how I wanted to serve God changed over time. And I started to feel like, hey, there's enough books been written. And we had spent a little time in El Salvador, a little time in Honduras, and I had a lot of questions. When I was in those places, I was interested in particular in social justice and what had the church's involvement there in the past decades meant for those people. What had the United States' involvement meant? And
that would definitely take the mind right there.
I had come from an agricultural background, and I was realizing how much our agricultural policies in the U.S. had influenced their lives. And I was starting to get really interested in, okay, if we really care about people and how we live together, the economy is such a fundamental thing. Like, how does the way we do business together either allow for flourishing or not? And yeah, I found myself back at Carroll teaching a couple of adjunct classes and managing the freshman dorms. And during my time in Boston, I had plenty of colleagues, just other students that were from all over the world. And in particular, the ones from the U.S. who had come from the East Coast were really interested in, didn't you know cattle are bad for the environment and meat is bad for health? And so I started reading kind of more deeply in the agricultural space, not just in land management, but the food system. And then lo and behold, when I was back at Carroll, my own family was part of this cooperative. It was a startup, and I hired on with that startup. There was two employees. There was a CEO and then little old me. And I started learning how to price cattle, try to build a brand, find processing, find buyers. And I got a bit of a bath in the business side of things and in the meat industry. And anyway, that failed after 5 years, so I learned a lot of good hard lessons.
Right. Mm-hmm. Suffering in your service.
Yeah, I was always interested in the enabling conditions. How do things come to be a certain way? How are the rules set up to encourage certain outcomes? Mm-hmm. So as a kid, I asked why constantly. Mm-hmm. And that's just how I'm built. And so after that, I went to work for this policy organization called Western Landowners Alliance, which its mission was to essentially keep working lands intact for the benefit not only of agriculture, but of native species. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a blend of conservation and ranching. And anyway, started to understand a little bit about the Farm Bill, how it came to be, the Endangered Species Act, how it came to be, water policy, rangeland policy, particularly how the West was shaped by, since my family had come to the Blackfoot Valley and had been ranching there since before Montana was a state. So it was interesting, to see that narrated
from different perspectives.
From the academic perspective, not just how I perceive the place that I grew up.
Right, because we have our family narratives that are faulty.
Oh, yeah. Every single narrative we have is faulty in plenty of ways, and also true in some ways. And so, yeah, I was just trying to come to understand the world and shaped my own sense of what the hell I'm going to do with my life.
Have you found any internal conflict in terms of what you were told about your family history and what you're learning about history from different perspectives? I ask that question because I've had some painful awarenesses, not necessarily about my family directly, but about, so for instance, I read the book, The Paris Library, and it talked about World War II and the American library in Paris and the people who were patrons there and the people who were employees there during World War II, and the setup of how things turned into this fascist regime and how they and how people participated in the Nazi occupation.
Yeah.
And I started doing some research and seeing that indeed some Jews were involved in the turning in of other Jews. And then also that there were Jewish slave owners in the U.S. It ended up being one of those rabbit holes that I went a few different directions. And I remember I probably knew that there were Jewish people who owned slaves, but I always hated the idea that that could be true because Jews were slaves too at some point. Why would somebody with that history go into it? And I know it's complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of why and how. And I also know that there were lots of Jews involved in the railroad to get slaves into freedom. And there were lots of Jews involved in the freedom movement in the 60s, and lots of Jews murdered for that purpose. But at the same time, hearing that history, knowing that there were people, my people, involved in that kind of painful history, it reminded me of my friend whose grandfather was an SS soldier, and she didn't want to tell me that because we were so close. And she didn't want me to know her family history. And there's that edge of, where do we go from here? Because it's not about shame, ever, or it shouldn't be, because it wasn't me there. And I had nothing to do with it, but I may benefit in some way from that history. And the same with my friend who's the granddaughter of an active SS, so like a Nazi. And my answer to her was, you are a kind person. You wouldn't stand by and let that happen. You definitely wouldn't be involved in the active turning in and murder of Jews or any other community of people. So knowing your history, I think, is far more important than being ashamed of it.
Totally. I really agree that just trying to look it square in the face and understand it as best you can. It's complicated. We're all, nature and nurture. And we all, if we're honest with ourselves, have we all have darkness inside. And in the right environment, that can come out. And who's to say exactly how we would have behaved in those circumstances, and
right.
Yeah.
To save our own lives or to save the lives of our children.
Yeah. Or because it's unpopular.
Right.
Not just unpopular, but it's very scary to resist power.
Dangerous.
Yeah. And
as we've seen.
Risking, yourself, but your family. If you stand up and do what's right, particularly in times like you're discussing.
Right.
And so for me, coming to understand, like, we were kind of lucky in the sense of knowing our history better than some. Like, we have these letters from the first person to have settled, one of the first people to have settled in the Blackfoot Valley, white person, this guy named John Moore, who was my grandmother's great-great-grandfather. He had come from West Virginia after the war, fought on the north, his brother on the south, and we have all these letters that he wrote to his brother after he moved to Montana, first mining and then eventually doing agriculture, trying to convince his brother that, of why he did what he did, and trying to convince his brother maybe to move out to Montana. And so we have all these letters from very early on. And then we have more letters from my grandfather in the 40s and 50s, a whole new era. That was, 80 years later, as he was a young kid and the ranch was on the rocks and his dad was dying and he was early 20s trying to figure out how do we make a living in this little valley. So, I mean, we have an appreciation as a family for how difficult it is to set up a life that is viable on the land in Montana. And then also, come into terms with how we came to be in that place and how the natives were pushed out and how we were part of that. And, exploited people exploit. We were fleeing, parts of the family were fleeing the potato famine in Ireland and all the injustice that people in Ireland had experienced from the English. And anyway, there's just as much as I could admire what it took to survive in the Blackfoot Valley and some of the work ethic of those people, how much they dealt with, how creative and resourceful they were. I really can admire that. And at the same time, can regret what our society was part of in displacing and doing a whole bunch of injustice to everybody who was here for us.
That is such a critical reminder. I mean, thinking about how do we change the cycle? And I feel like that's a lot of what you are doing now in the work you're doing is not ending a cycle, but shifting the focus so that we can reduce the exploitation, so that we can acknowledge wrongdoing and move forward as a global community, especially when it comes to food sustainability.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of people talk or as if we're sort of, the goal is to hearken back to some era where we did it right.
Well, we did aspects right, but
I mean, there was
no golden time, really.
There's some things in our tradition that have been handed down that are so valuable, and we do well to recover
the work ethic,
to recover them. Yep, and just whether it was because we were wise or whether it was just because it was the way life was then, more connected to as communities.
Yes,
a more real sense of how we depend on each other on a daily basis, like certain things, being much closer to our vulnerability and how much we depend on the natural world. We can be insulated from that today. So certain late things to recover. But I mean, so much of human history has been us spoiling our nests eventually because of the way we come to develop our economies and our value sets and how we define wealth and success. And we no longer have the luxury of moving on to a new place. There is no new undeveloped frontier. And we have to begin to become wiser and to figure out how to live together. And although Leopold said that the oldest task in human history is to learn how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And that if land is not just a resource, but if it's a living thing, and if everything from the microbes in the soil to the wildlife that are part of that place to the people, if we're all siblings, basically, if we're all kin, then we have to learn how to do justice to each other. And so what I'm interested in is how our food system that, in the United States, my family has raised sheep and cattle since before Montana was a state.
Which was, and
so Montana became a state in 1889, I believe.
Right.
1882 is when the Mannix side got to the Blackfoot Valley. But we've, kind of lived through the changes in the industry.
Right.
And it took me a long time to realize that essentially our food system has been not like one person master planned it. Like this evolves over so many different...
Through a variety of reasons, greed and desperation.
Well, yeah, and convenience. And, we talked about World War II. I mean, after World War II, there was this question of, okay, the U.S. now has, it's geopolitically, it has one of the greatest advantages of any country ever because of how sort of defensible our coasts are and how productive, the land is. And it was unsettled, quote unquote.
Yeah, right.
Right. It was sort of unexploited. And so anyway, the U.S. has all these advantages. And then after World War II, a war that was not fought on our own soil, and yet we hugely benefited from economically, there was a question of, will there be a Pax Americana? Will the U.S. occupy all these other places that were in bad shape because of the war? And we decided that, well, if we use our Navy to enforce a free trade, then perhaps we can have this new era where growth everywhere allows every country to sort of improve their stead and that can be sort of doing business together can sort of be what keeps the peace.
Right. A rising tide lifts all ships is what you hear.
So that was the Bretton Woods sort of arrangement. Mm-hmm. And so our food policy has hugely been developed around national security, producing as many calories with as much certainty as we possibly can, and having geopolitical power, not so much around what is healthy soil or bionutrient dense food or economic justice. It's funny to think, oh yeah, we never actually, the food system was not built with that intention, and it's succeeding. And it
in the worst possible way.
It, like so many other industries, maybe all other industries, has been focused on profit. And that always ends up meaning profit for the people who are in power.
Right.
And I'm interested in not so much how do I go change this big system. Buckminster Fuller said that you don't change something by fighting what's established. You change something, this is paraphrasing obviously, by creating a better model that makes the old one obsolete. And so I'm more interested in, could we create a little model, a little microeconomy for the exchange of what I grew up with my family raising, livestock, that does more justice to all the different parts, everything that happens on the land, all the people who are then processing and preparing that food, and then ultimately the customers who depend, who are it's becoming part of their bodies and part of their lives. So Old Salt started in 2020, and it's a lot of people, I think of agriculture as being, they usually reduce the term agriculture to production. Like agriculture is farming, agriculture is ranching, but agriculture is a culture. It is a system. And so you can't, for many years, there's been all these producers who are actually doing management of land really pretty well. But then that food enters the supply chain, and that supply chain is basically designed to funnel money to the brands that ultimately are closest to the customer. So today we have Walmart, Walmart is as big as the next 8 food retailers in our country combined. And the market power, you think of Walmart, you think of Cargill, you think of JBS, the market power of those companies bends everything else around their priorities. And it ends up not doing justice to soil, not doing justice to communities, not doing justice to the people who are eating this food, their health. And it's you don't just solve that. You don't just come up with the brand.
Right. And think people are just going to jump on board and pay more, and even if it's better.
If product A doesn't have that great of provenance behind it, and product B does, if you put product B on a Walmart shelf, it will very quickly either leave the shelf or be diluted because it can't survive on a Walmart shelf.
Right.
Why? Because Walmart squeezes all of its suppliers. And at the end of the day, if they squeeze their suppliers and their suppliers squeeze their employees and their suppliers, you end up sort of pushing people at the headwaters of the supply chain down to the very bare bones, where all they can do to survive is just try to pay their debt.
So
simplify their systems.
Let's make sure our listeners understand what that means. What I'm hearing you say is, I remember hearing this story about Costco, even though I know that they are doing better. They're more conscious now than they were maybe 10 years ago. But I remember hearing that they would require the price of something, say Wheat Montana bread. We get the sliced loaves of Wheat Montana bread for next to nothing at almost any grocery store. I can go to the Town and Country that used to be Vans in town and get a loaf of that if it's on sale for $2.50 or $3.50, sometimes $4. And it's sliced and it's beautiful and it's made locally, relatively locally, right? It's 60 miles away. But if it goes to Costco, they are going to have to charge a lot less to make it worthwhile. And so they're going to want to pay a lot less. So for every loaf that's $3 at Town and Country probably gets $1.50. They usually double the price, right? Ish.
Yeah, I'm not, it's different for every product, but oftentimes a retailer will have between a 25 and a 40% margin.
Okay. So let's say that they're making half of it, 50% on it, where Costco requires Wheat Montana to sell them their bread at 50 cents a loaf instead of $2.50 a loaf, because that's their way of differentiating their pricing. So if Costco is selling it for 50 cents a loaf, that's barely covering the cost to Wheat Montana, not providing profit, and barely covering enough to pay their employees a living wage, much less paying attention to the land and the soil and making sure they're getting the most out of everything. So they might shortcut things so that it costs less for them so that they can pay their employees. Is that a good example of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. When you are, we'll just take ranching. Mm-hmm. What you sell are pounds of usually animal.
Right.
You're not necessarily selling meat. You're selling animals further into the supply chain. But what you sell is essentially pounds of livestock. But what you take care of is fish habitat and soil health and public access. And
I hope so.
Grizzly bear habitat, wolf habitat. But all those things are not monetizable in the same way as a pound of livestock. So if you are in a difficult economic position without a lot of power, and you've got a loan payment to pay and you're a busy person, then if you're squeezed, the things that begin to fall out of that equation are everything you can't sell. It takes time to think about how you graze well, and have a diversity of plant species. And you, instead of taking shortcuts like chemical to control weeds, control that with strategy, control it with diverse species of livestock, control it by developing your water differently, different fencing systems. If you're going to live with grizzly bears and not just kill what's inconvenient, that takes time and thoughtful management. It's artwork. Every landscape is different. So even if there's really good principles of regenerative management of land, how those principles actually play out is this constant process of doing something, an intervention, measuring it, observing what happens, tweaking what you're doing, and then just constantly iterating. And it's art. It's like a sculpture. Like you begin honing things away, figuring out what doesn't work, and then eventually, if you're allowed to be an artist, it becomes beautiful. Mm. But when the food system becomes about power, ultimately the downstream where the money ends up kind of squeezing the upstream so much that not enough rain falls back in the headwaters to sustain stewardship. Mm. When you think of like the difference between, I like to describe the difference between regenerative agriculture and more conventional, which is kind of what happens today in our country, as the difference between a stream and a canal. A stream and the canal both move water from point A to point B, but in a stream you have water getting kind of spilled out and in these pockets and riffles, and there's logs, and it's less efficient, but there's so many life happens in the inefficiency. So what might be
and
waste,
the ebb and flow of the height of the water, how much water is flowing through ebbs and flows, where a canal is more rigidly controlled.
it sort of has one purpose, a canal does, whereas the stream is just home to all these things that are sort of, one thing feeds off of the inefficiency of another thing. So as soon as you start to marshal a system towards a single purpose like profit, you end up losing all the other forms of life that are a huge part of what makes living worthwhile and beautiful.
Right.
And those are communities, habitat, health. You simplify something to be just calories, and you don't realize, like, oh, there are thousands and thousands of micronutrient compounds that we have hardly any idea about or how they affect our health, but actually do. It's really hard to,
Right.
to isolate that in a lab.
And to measure it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we have now, there's a few kind of wonderful studies that have been done in Utah State, where they're basically said, okay, well, there's thousands of compounds. Normally what you see on a nutrition label, I think there's 16.
Mm-hmm.
There's, they said, well, we're going to take about 300 others, and we're going to see if there's a significant difference. And this was in livestock. So they're going to see if there's a significant difference in the rates at which those 300 other compounds show up in meat from animals that have received a diverse diet throughout their lives versus animals that have been, at a certain point, put in a feedlot and fed just cereal crops. And what they've found is, yes, there are significant differences, but we just barely scratching the surface of what do those significant differences mean for health outcomes.
Right.
Because as we know, like in nutrition, health outcomes are really hard to sort out. They have to do with genetics. They have to do with your personal habits. And they have to do not just with the what's in your diet from the perspective of more nutrient dense meat versus less, but also what else is in your diet.
Right, right.
How much alcohol, how much everything else, right?
Mm-hmm. And how much exercise you get. And
so it's
genetic predispositions. And it is complicated. But I'm thinking about, like, I notice the difference in my body when I'm fueling my body with food that is fresh or locally sourced. So, like, every summer, I get almost all of our produce from the farmer's market, and the farm, particularly one that is outside of Missoula, and they don't use any pesticides. They're not considered organic because they've never gone through the certification process, but they don't use pesticides. And my body always feels healthier at the end of the summer than it does in the winter. Even though I'm hiking, I'm still eating veggies and fruit, but I'm not getting it from the same place. And I notice a difference. So I think if more of us paid attention to that, we would see it. But I think, as you said, if you're being squeezed, and it's not just the producers of these products, the first part of the product, which would be the animal, growing the animal or growing the vegetable or whatever, but people who are trying to work 2 jobs and barely being able to pay their rent. As we know, Montana was just listed, particularly Helena, as one of the least affordable places to live in the world, but particularly in our country, not because the rent is so high, because comparatively, we might pay $1,200 where somebody in New York or San Francisco would pay, New York City or San Francisco would pay $2,200, whatever, double that, but because our salaries aren't keeping up at all. So I think, how is anybody that doesn't have the luxury of paying attention to how their body feels going to notice the difference and invest in the difference, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think when you zoom out, what we can know is that our health outcomes are not good as a society. 1 in 2 people has a chronic disease. Our ecological trajectory is not promising as a whole. And you don't have to go so far as climate volatility to notice that. We're sending the fertile skin of the earth, our soil, down our rivers, and it's winding up in the Gulf, and where it creates oxygen deficiencies and algal blooms and fish die. And even if the climate was not changing, even if we were not affecting its stability, you can't just lose your soil and be sustainable.
Right.
So there's many things that aren't working. And you've mentioned, if most people are not better off than they were, several generations ago, and yet the overall amount of money in the system is so much more.
Right.
This discrepancy between those who have and those who don't is not healthy for society. And like we started from the beginning, we said exploited people exploit. And they exploit each other. They exploit their resource base. And so that's not, something I want to participate in. And we all do to a degree. But what I'm passionate about is just how can we build these little pockets of things that make sense? Mm-hmm. Because we can see that, hey, if it's possible, then it's worth serving. Like, if it's possible,
emulating.
Yeah, if it's possible, there's something to be done. We don't just have to sit back and be resolved to our fate. And that's what I want my boys to feel is that, hey, yeah, life is challenging, and there's plenty of things that are bleak, but there are ways to be that give life and that are beautiful, and that's hope,
I love that. That's kind of the perfect place to turn it around and come to a conclusion. So I would love to hear one thing. So you did the Old Salt Festival. Was this the third year, 2025?
Yeah.
So year 3, the Old Salt Festival for our listeners is a full weekend of events in Helmville, Montana, near the Mannix Ranch and on the Mannix Ranch properties, where they put together panel discussions on conservation and land use and all of those things, plus some live music, chefs that come from a variety of places to provide food for people. They can camp there. It's 2.5 full days of events. And so I'm imagining you are watching. It's Saturday afternoon. You're not actually participating. You're hosting and you're observing, because I know what it's like to plan an event and then observe the interactions. I can already see, because we're sitting together, and unfortunately our listeners don't get this opportunity. You already have a vision in your head, like something you saw and noticed sometime on that weekend that made you go, yeah, this is why I do this. This makes it all worthwhile. What's that image? What are you seeing?
I'm seeing people connect to each other in a way that you don't at just a party.
Right.
Just a party I'm all about. I love parties.
Of course.
But there's another headspace people get into when they're feeling like this matters. You can see how engaged they are. I think we're hungrier than ever for meaning and connection with each other and to things that are hopeful, things that have a future. So the festival was meant to be a cultural event, because agriculture is a culture and we need a better culture. Yes. Agricultural change is cultural change. So we have to change the way we see. How do we see the ways in which we are connected, in which your health is tied to my own health, like the way that we share a common destiny. And how do we celebrate that way of seeing? And then what are some of the ways that people are applying it in all kinds of different spheres? So I think some of the most rewarding things about the festival are when people are writing to us saying, hey, I came and I just moved to Montana from, this one guy wrote, just moved from the tech world, retired, but I've been searching for like, what is next? Like, how will I spend my time? And I left with a really clear sense of what I'm going to do next. That is,
just gotta chill.
That's magic.
That is magic. Having that common goal and the common values. I'm not going to say beliefs, because those are really different, but having common values and realizing that we can contribute in some way. And I've said this before, you can't build community if you don't allow and encourage contribution and reciprocity. You just can't. And so many leaders, we're great at giving, but not great at receiving. So we have to model that. Oh,
True.
I love that. Cole, this has been such a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you for the visit.
Thank you. Listeners, now it's your turn. What have you been thinking about during this conversation? Did anything in particular remind you of something that happened that helped you understand your purpose, your mission, where you can serve? I'd be really curious to hear if something came up for you and you developed any kind of clarity around what you want to do next to contribute, to bring your version of reciprocity to your environment and your community. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
You must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.